Our Old Testament reading for today is from Isaiah chapter 40, starting at verse 21. And this is a lesson from the time where the Israelites were in exile and were about to get the chance to be able to head home after generations of being in exile in Babylon. Have you not known? Have you not heard? Has it not been told you from the beginning? Have you not understood from the foundations of the earth? It is he who sits above the circle of the earth, and its inhabitants are like grasshoppers, who stretches out the heavens like a curtain and spreads them like a tent to live in, who brings princes to naught and makes the rulers of the earth as nothing. Scarcely are they planted, scarcely sown, scarcely has their stem taken root in the earth, when he blows upon it, and they wither, and the tempest carries them off like stubble. To whom then will you compare me, or who is my equal, says the Holy One. Lift up your eyes on high and see. Who created these? He who brings out their host and numbers them, calling them all by name, because he is great in strength, mighty in power, not one is missing. Why do you say, O Jacob, and speak, O Israel, my way is hidden from the Lord, and my right is disregarded by my God? Have you not known? Have you not heard? The Lord is the everlasting God, the creator of the ends of the earth. He does not grow faint or grow weary. His understanding is unsearchable. He gives power to the faint and strengthens the powerless. Even youths will faint and be weary, and the young will fall exhausted. But those who wait for the Lord shall renew their strength. They shall mount up with wings like eagles. They shall run and not be weary. They shall walk and not faint. Our New Testament reading is from Luke chapter 24, starting at the 13th verse. Now on that same day, two of them were going to a village called Emmaus, about 7 miles from Jerusalem, and talking with each other about all these things that had happened. When they were talking and discussing, Jesus himself came near and went with them, but their eyes were kept from recognizing him. And he said to them, "What are you discussing with each other while you walk along?" They stood still, looking sad, and one of them, whose name was Cleopas, answered him, "Are you the only stranger in Jerusalem who does not know the things that have taken place there in these days?" He asked them, "What things?" They replied, "The things about Jesus of Nazareth, who was a prophet mighty in deed and word before God and all the people, and how all our chief priests and leaders handed him over to be condemned to death and crucified him. But we had hoped that he was the one to redeem Israel. Yes, and besides all this, it is now the 3rd day since these things took place. Moreover, some women of our group astounded us. They were at the tomb early this morning, and when they did not find his body there, they came back and told us that they had indeed seen a vision of angels who said that he was alive. Some of those who were with us went to the tomb and found it just as the women had said, but they did not see him." Then he said to them, "Oh, how foolish you are, and how slow of heart to believe all that the prophets have declared. Was it not necessary that the Messiah should suffer these things and then enter into his glory?" Then, beginning with Moses and all the prophets, he interpreted to them the things about himself in all the scriptures. As they came near the village to which they were going, he walked ahead as if he were going on. But they urged him to stay strongly, saying, "Stay with us, because it is almost evening, and the day is now nearly over." So he went in to stay with them. While he was at the table with them, he took bread, blessed it, and broke it, and gave it to them. And their eyes were opened, and they recognized him. And he vanished from their sight. They said to each other, "Were not our hearts burning within us while he was talking with us on the road, while he was opening the scriptures to us?" That same hour they got up and returned to Jerusalem, and they found the 11 and their companions gathered together. They were saying, "The Lord has risen indeed and has appeared to Simon." Then they told what had happened on the road and how he had been made known to them in the breaking of the bread. Our gospel lesson for today takes place on the afternoon and evening of that very first Easter day. This road to Emmaus story is important in the gospel according to Luke because it's when the disciples finally get a chance to actually see Jesus. In Luke's account of the women going to the tomb early that Easter morning, they find the stone rolled away and meet two angels who tell them the good news of Christ's resurrection. But Jesus doesn't meet them then. The women in Luke believe and report what they've seen to the rest of the disciples without actually seeing the risen Lord. So the account of Jesus meeting these disciples on the road to Emmaus finishes out the process of the disciples understanding that Christ is risen indeed. At the start of the lesson, these two disciples have heard the news the women have brought from the tomb, and they decide to go on a 7-mile walk to the village of Emmaus. We don't really know why they were going there, just that they were. So they're walking along, discussing the things that had happened with Jesus being crucified and then the women finding the tomb empty. And one commentator pointed out that these guys are discussing the latest news. And in this time of pandemic, I've been doing a lot of discussing the news with people. Pandemic news is everywhere, and it seems things move so fast. New recommendations from experts and orders from the government come at an incredible clip as scientists learn new things and better data becomes available to public health officials. There's so much to know, read, discuss, learn, and then unlearn as more things are found out. It can be overwhelming. And actually, a lot of mental health professionals suggest rationing our news intake during this time so we don't end up overwhelmed or, frankly, depressed. So these two disciples are walking along discussing the big must-know news story of the day, and it's Jesus. And while they're talking about him, Jesus enters the scene and starts walking and talking with them, but they don't recognize him. The text leaves it up to our imagination as to why they don't recognize him. Was it grief that blinded them? Was there some divine power at work? Was it a combination? We just don't know. So Jesus comes up to these two fellas and asks them what they're talking about, and these disciples are flabbergasted that someone would be unaware of what has happened the past week. For us, it would be like encountering someone who doesn't know that there's a pandemic happening. So in a textbook moment of dramatic irony, these disciples proceed to explain Jesus' own story to him. The part that's been sticking out to me on this reading is that Cleopas, who's one of the two guys there, says, "We had hoped he was the one to redeem Israel." There's a lot that could be said about this strange time we find ourselves in, but a lot of it could be summed up as things we had hoped for that just haven't panned out. We had hoped to be physically in church together. We had hoped that this time of social distancing would be over by now. Students had hoped to be with all their teachers and friends. Students set to graduate from high school or college or graduate programs had hoped to have big in-person celebrations of graduation. They had hoped to have senior weeks and all the celebrations that mark important turning points in life. We had hoped to attend or be able to participate in so many sporting events or theatrical productions. We had hoped to be together for important holidays and life events. We had hoped to be able to physically show up for each other in times of grief or crisis. We had hoped this pandemic would pass us and those we love by. There are so many things we had hoped for, but they just haven't panned out the way we'd hoped. But while we're still in the middle of this crisis and hoping for the end, the disciples, unbeknownst to them, are actually in a different boat. Jesus starts explaining to them how actually he's redeemed the world, and when they approach Emmaus, the disciples invite Jesus to supper with them. And during supper, Jesus takes bread, blesses it, and breaks it, and gives it to them. And suddenly the disciples' eyes are opened, and they recognize that it is Jesus, their risen Lord. And then just as they recognize him, Jesus vanishes. What I want to lift up about this part of the Emmaus story is that profound religious experiences are often quite rare and fleeting. They don't last a long time. Cleopas and friend have this profound experience of the risen Christ, but then he's gone. They had to rely on what they remembered. They had to rely on the memory of this experience because it wasn't going to happen like that again. And they recognized Jesus in this moment because of their memory of being with him at the Last Supper. As the church, we have to rely on the power of memory a lot. Our individual memories of religious experiences, but more importantly, we have to rely on the memory of the church universal. None of us were alive that first Easter. We didn't get to see Jesus that day, but we trust the witness and memory of Scripture. And we do this with all the promises and experiences of God in the Bible. The church is the keeper of memories of generations of God's people, all trying to figure out a life of faith amidst the troubles of the world. And the good thing about this is that over the course of millennia, the people of God have gone through many dangers, toils, and snares. And when we experience something we've never gone through before, like, say, needing to cease in-person worship because of a pandemic, God's people in Scripture and throughout the history of the church have gone through this sort of thing before. The church has been in situations like this before, and God has always been faithful. Our lesson from Isaiah is making a similar sort of point. The prophet Isaiah is speaking to the Israelites who've been forcibly exiled from the promised land, and now they're about to get the chance to return home after generations away. And the people are nervous. They've been in Babylon a long time. Would they be able to survive in Israel? Was it going to be okay? And Isaiah responds to these sorts of questions with, "Have you not known? Have you not heard?" This is him basically asking, do you remember? Do you remember all the things that God has done? Do you remember how God has been faithful to us throughout generations? Do you remember that the Lord is the maker of heaven and earth? Do you remember what we've gone through before? Do you remember? We, the people of God, in every time and place can face what lies ahead because we can remember. We can remember back for generations and see that God has been faithful through all of it. We've been here before, and we can remember. We can remember back to Protestant reformer Martin Luther. In 1527, the bubonic plague, which had killed 25% of the European population in the 14th century, had returned to Wittenberg, Germany, where Luther was. And an article I read recounts Luther's situation. As the religious leader of his community, Martin Luther was obliged to address the question, may one flee the city in a time of plague? And so in his sermon, he counseled the government to establish centralized hospitals to avoid the contamination of individual homes and to move cemeteries outside of the city. And in words that sound familiar to us, he wrote, "Then I shall fumigate, help purify the air, administer medicine, and take it. I shall avoid places and persons where my presence is not needed, in order not to become contaminated and thus perchance infect and pollute others." What Luther is advocating here is the cutting-edge version of 1527 social distancing. The people of God have been through this before. In another article I read, the magazine was going back through their coverage of the 1918-1919 Spanish flu pandemic. And one of the articles notes that the second wave of Spanish flu closures hit right at the end of Advent as it was turning to Christmas. And just like now, churches had to figure out how to be the church when they couldn't meet together. And the magazine reported churches printed and sent out Sunday school booklets. They wrote up worship at home materials so people could have worship at home, and these were delivered to church members' doorsteps. They mailed out sermons. And then there's this line: machinery has been set in motion for the use of the telephone to carry church news concerning the sick and needy. And gosh, that sounds a lot like right now, except our forays into live streaming and video conferencing are what the telephone was to the church in 1919. The editors of the magazine also noted this about quarantine time: it will be a mistake to accept this as a vacation time for religion. And the same could be said for us right now. The people of God have been through this before and have come through. There's also the life of 17th century Protestant minister Martin Rinckart. He was a pastor in the German town of Eilenburg during the devastating 30 Years' War. And the influx of people fleeing the fighting and armies marching through led to horrible pestilence and famine in the town. In 1637, 8,000 people died of disease there, including all the other clergy in town and Rinkhart's wife. And he continued to serve the people of Eilenburg and officiated over 4,000 funerals that year, sometimes as many as 200 burials a week. And in that number were included the funerals of all his clergy colleagues in town and the funeral of his wife. So I can't even imagine what that was like and how much loss and grief surrounded Rinckart every single day. He must have been so tired. It just defies imagination. But in the midst of all that death and loss, Rinckart wrote a hymn of thanksgiving and praise to God, and it's become well known throughout history, and we actually usually sing it in the fall near Thanksgiving. And the hymn he wrote is, "Now Thank We All Our God." The first verse is all about remembering how faithful God has been throughout the generations. Now thank we all our God, with hearts and hands and voices, who wondrous things hath done, in whom his world rejoices, who from our mother's arms has blessed us on our way with countless gifts of love, and still is ours today. That's the hope we have as the people of God. We know that God has always been faithful to his people, and that God is still ours today. This word is true and worthy of full acceptance. Our God is with us to whatever end and won't leave us. And we can look at the whole history of the people of God and know that this is true. There's a lot we had hoped for about this time, and a lot of those hopes have been dashed. But the great hope that will never fail is that our God will be with us wherever we go, even to death and back. That's the good news of the resurrection. And because of that, there is bright hope for tomorrow. The second verse of Now Thank We All Our God highlights that great hope. And it's certainly my prayer for all of us as we go through this time. O may this bounteous God through all our life be near us, with ever joyful hearts and blessed peace to cheer us, and keep us in his grace, and guide us when perplexed, and free us from all ills in this world and the next. Amen.